Good evening, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we drift back through time together, I'd love to know something. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? Are you curled up in bed, already cozy under the blankets, or maybe lying awake hoping sleep will come soon? Wherever you are, I want you to feel at home here. If today was a good day, I'm happy for you. If it was a hard one, I send you peace and warmth as you rest. You are welcome here, you are safe here, and this time belongs just to you. So, take a deep breath, let the world outside wait until tomorrow, and let's begin our gentle journey through the secret history of salt, the little crystal that shaped empires. Salt, the sparkling mystery. That small crystal, sparkling white under a flame or glowing faintly in the moonlight, has been called by many names through the ages. Some called it the gift of the gods, others called it the tears of the earth, and for countless centuries traders, farmers, emperors and priests whispered of it as white gold. Tonight we will wander slowly and calmly through this secret history of salt. We will not rush. Instead, we will drift as if along a quiet river at night, stopping to notice the places, the people, and the empires that rose and fell under salt's silent influence. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the story take shape in your imagination. Picture the grains themselves, simple, tiny, yet powerful enough to shape destiny. Salt and survival. Imagine yourself thousands of years ago, long before cities or empires, when humans were still learning to tame the land. Survival was fragile. The body needed food, water, fire, and it also needed salt. Without it, our muscles cannot work. Our blood cannot flow as it should. Nomadic tribes searched for it not as a luxury, but as a lifeline. Hunters who lived on fresh meat found they craved it desperately. Farmers who worked under the blazing sun knew their sweat carried it away. And so, across continents, people wandered in search of places where the earth itself gave salt as a gift, shimmering white crusts on dry riverbeds, or glittering crystals left by the retreating sea. In those moments, salt was not seasoning, it was survival. Salt as a mirror of civilization. As the centuries passed and humans settled, salt took on new meaning. It was not only about staying alive, it became a measure of progress. Where there was salt, there was agriculture that lasted. Where there was salt, food could be preserved. A fisherman in ancient times, catching more than his family could eat in a day, found that with salt he could dry the fish, carry it inland, and trade it for grain. Suddenly, salt was a bridge, connecting land to sea, farmer to fisher, village to village. And so, wherever people gathered, stories of salt soon followed. Salt in myth and spirit. Salt was also a mystery. Why did these small white crystals seem so pure? Why did they preserve life from decay? Ancient peoples began to weave salt into their myths. In some places, salt was seen as the very essence of purity, used in rituals to chase away evil spirits. In others, it was a symbol of loyalty. To share salt with a guest was to promise trust and protection. In the Bible, there is the phrase "a covenant of salt," suggesting something unbreakable, enduring, eternal. The Japanese placed salt at the door to keep away wandering ghosts. The Romans sprinkled salt on the heads of animals before sacrifice. Even today, people toss a pinch of salt over the left shoulder to drive away bad luck. Salt was more than food. It was faith, the first currency of trust. Now, as you let your body sink deeper into rest, imagine salt not as something sprinkled from a small shaker, but as something so rare, so treasured, that it moved like currency. Before coins or paper money, many goods were traded by weight and measure. Salt was among the most precious. A pouch of salt could buy livestock. A measure of salt could seal a marriage dowry. In some languages, the word for salt became the root of words for wealth or wages. Think of that for a moment. The very pay that Roman soldiers received, their salary, comes from sal, the Latin word for salt. What we earn today carries in its name a memory of ancient crystals passed from hand to hand, the flow of empires. And so, empires began to notice. To control salt was to control life itself. Kings built roads to salt mines. Cities rose along salt routes. Battles were fought and borders drawn, not just for land or gold, but for access to the veins of salt beneath the earth. Salt was the quiet ruler, invisible yet ever present. It fed armies. It allowed ships to sail further by keeping their provisions fresh. It filled treasuries with taxes. And when rulers grew greedy, salt became the seed of rebellion. Yes, this little grain could build empires and just as swiftly destroy them. You may wonder why we begin this journey at night as you rest and drift towards sleep. Perhaps it is because salt itself has always been a companion to quiet hours. It glimmers in the lamplight on the dining table. It sits in the background of every meal, unnoticed yet essential. And just as salt lingers quietly in daily life, its history lingers quietly in our collective memory, seldom told, yet always there. Tonight, we give it a voice. This will not be a story of loud battles or rushing events. It will be a gentle unfolding, like a candle burning slowly, like waves retreating from the shore. Each chapter will bring you deeper into time, from the dawn of civilization, to ancient empires, to the deserts crossed by caravans, to revolutions and independence movements, to the world we know today. At every step, salt will be there, sometimes hidden, sometimes shining. As you breathe steadily, think of the journey that awaits. We will walk with the first farmers who discovered how salt could keep food through winter. We will travel with Roman legions marching along the Via Salaria, their salt road. We will cross deserts with caravans in Africa, their camels laden with blocks of salt as precious as gold. We will stand with Gandhi on the shores of India, where salt became the banner of freedom, and we will reflect on the salt of today, in our kitchens, our industries, our oceans, and our future. This is more than history. This is a meditation on something timeless. So, as we begin, let the day's worries fall aside. Imagine the simple crystal, white and pure, resting in your hand. Think of how many countless hands have held the same. From ancient hunters to medieval cooks, from kings to commoners, salt has passed through them all. And now it passes to you, not as wealth, not as a burden, but as a story. Let us begin our journey together, slowly and calmly, with the dawn of civilization, where salt first stepped into human history. Chapter 2. Salt in the Dawn of Civilization. As we begin to move gently into the first chapter of our story, let us drift far back in time, beyond the great empires, beyond the rise of cities, to the earliest days of human civilization. A time when survival itself was fragile, and the simplest things held the greatest power. In those ancient days, salt was more than a seasoning. It was a lifeline, a treasure, and slowly, it became the foundation upon which whole communities were built. Tonight, we will wander through that early world and see how salt shaped humanity at its dawn. Close your eyes and imagine yourself as a hunter-gatherer thousands of years ago. You walk barefoot across warm earth, carrying little more than a spear and a pouch. You eat fresh meat, wild fruits, perhaps roots pulled from the soil. For a while it seems enough. But then a strange weakness grows. Your muscles ache, your energy fades, and you feel dizzy under the sun. Without knowing it, your body is crying out for salt. Humans lose salt through sweat and need it to keep their bodies in balance. Without it, life itself falters. And so, in those early days, men and women learned to look for places where the earth glittered with white crystals, left behind by ancient seas. They gathered salt from dried riverbeds, from rocks near the ocean, or from pools where water evaporated under the sun. When they found it, it was as if they had found medicine or magic. Over time, as people began to settle, salt became the reason some villages survived while others faded away. Archaeologists tell us of some of the oldest salt works in the world, places where ancient people boiled brine or scraped crystals from the ground. One such site is in present-day Romania, near a place called Poiana Slatinei. There, evidence suggests humans were boiling salty water as far back as 6,000 years ago. Imagine the fires glowing under clay pots, the steam rising, the slow collection of those precious crystals. Even then, salt was already at the heart of human life. In China, some of the earliest dynasties built entire communities around salt springs. Families passed down the knowledge of where to find it, how to collect it, how to protect it. Salt was no longer just something the body needed, it became something the community depended on. Now picture the birth of farming. Early people began to grow grain, tend flocks, and store food, but grain could rot, meat could spoil. Without preservation, food security was uncertain. Salt changed that. With it, fish could be dried and stored for months. Meat could be cured, lasting long into the winter. Grain porridge, once bland and tasteless, could be made flavorful with just a pinch. Suddenly, food could travel, could be traded, could be kept for lean times. Salt was not just survival anymore, it was progress, it was stability. It was the very ingredient that allowed people to stay in one place and grow. As food became stable and societies grew, salt found another role, a spiritual one. For the earliest farmers and herders, life was uncertain. Drought, floods, pests, disease. The world was full of dangers. People sought symbols of protection, purity, and endurance. Salt became that symbol. In ancient Mesopotamia, salt was offered in temples to honor the gods. In Egypt, it was used to purify offerings and bodies alike. In faraway Japan, salt was sprinkled before shrines and at the doorsteps of homes to ward off wandering spirits. Imagine a small clay bowl filled with salt, set carefully before a fire or a shrine. The crystals catch the light, shining white and clear. For those who placed them, salt was not just food, it was a promise of safety, a barrier against decay, a link to the divine. Myths began to grow around it. Some told that salt came from the tears of the sea, wept by the gods. Others believed it was a gift left by divine hands to keep humans alive. In many cultures, sharing salt with another was sacred, a symbol of trust. To eat another's salt was to accept their friendship and protection. Even today, echoes of this remain. We say someone is worth their salt. We still throw a pinch of salt over the shoulder to chase away bad luck. These small gestures are ancient whispers, reminders of salt's mythic past. As villages grew and farming spread, people began to trade. And what did they carry along those first rough paths? Often it was salt. Salt was light enough to be carried in baskets, yet valuable enough to be worth the effort. In many early cultures, salt became one of the first traded commodities, linking inland villages with coastal settlements. Fishermen salted their catch and traded it inland. Farmers traded their grain for salt to season and preserve it. The paths of salt soon became the first trade routes, stretching across landscapes, connecting people who had once lived apart. Salt was beginning to tie humanity together. Take a moment to imagine the miracle it must have seemed in those early days. To take a piece of meat, sprinkle it with salt, and see it last not for hours, not for days, but for weeks or even months. Preservation meant survival. It meant armies could march further. It meant sailors could voyage longer. It meant communities could endure winters without fear of starvation. All of this began in those first humble days of salt use, thousands of years before empires rose. So, as we look back on those earliest times, it is clear, salt was never just a seasoning. It was survival, stability, trade, and faith. It was the invisible thread weaving together the first fabric of civilization. Without salt, many of the world's earliest settlements might never have endured. Without salt, agriculture would have been weaker, trade slower, rituals emptier. Salt was the quiet seed from which human society grew strong. As you lie here, listening, let yourself drift into that ancient world. Picture the first fires lit to boil brine, the first markets where salt was exchanged, the first prayers whispered over small bowls of white crystals. The dawn of civilization was marked not only by tools or writing or cities, but by salt. The small, sparkling grains in your imagination tonight were once the very foundation of human life. And as we leave this chapter gently behind, we prepare to step forward into the age of empires, where salt would not only support daily life, but also shape the rise and fall of mighty powers. Chapter 3: Salt in Ancient Empires. Now that we have drifted through the dawn of civilization, let us step softly into the age of empires. Humanity has grown, villages have become cities, and cities are beginning to shape the destiny of nations. But still, beneath all the noise of armies and rulers, salt is there, quiet, constant, and powerful. Salt does not shout for attention, yet it appears everywhere in the story of empires. It flows in the rivers, it glitters in the deserts, it fills the storerooms of kings, and it lingers in the prayers of priests. Tonight, we will wander through three great worlds of antiquity, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, and see how each built its might upon the white gold of salt. Let us begin in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow through the heart of modern-day Iraq. Here, some of the earliest city-states rose: Ur, Uruk, Babylon, each a jewel of early human history. The rivers gave water, fertile soil, and trade routes, but they also gave salt. As the waters receded in the summer sun, white crusts of salt glittered along the banks and in the marshes. These deposits became one of Mesopotamia's hidden treasures. Cuneiform tablets pressed into clay thousands of years ago speak of salt rations for workers and offerings of salt to the gods. Salt was weighed, measured, and taxed. It was so valuable that it appeared alongside grain and silver in records of trade. Imagine the marketplace of Ur. Merchants call out, donkeys bray, the smell of roasted bread drifts through the air. Among the goods displayed, cloth, grain, beer, small sacks of white crystals sit in the sun. Buyers inspect them carefully, knowing that these tiny grains could preserve their food, heal their bodies, and honor their gods. Salt in Mesopotamia was not just food, it was law, it was ritual, it was wealth, and already it was teaching rulers the power of control. To command the salt trade was to command the life of a city. From Mesopotamia, let us drift westward down the Nile into the golden sands of Egypt. Here, salt took on meanings far deeper than trade or food. The Egyptians saw salt as a bridge between life and death. They used a type of salt called natron, a natural mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate found in desert lakes. To the Egyptians, natron was a holy gift. When a body was prepared for mummification, it was washed, cleansed, and then packed with natron. Over many weeks, the salt drew out moisture, preserving the flesh, keeping the form of the body intact. To the Egyptians, this was not mere preservation, it was the promise of eternity. The body had to remain whole so that the spirit could live forever. Imagine the quiet of an embalming chamber. The air is cool and dry. Priests in linen robes move carefully, chanting prayers as they cover the body with crystals of natron. The white powder gleams in the lamplight. Outside, the Nile flows endlessly, carrying boats, fish, and life. Inside, salt carries the soul into eternity. But salt was not only for the dead, it flavored food, preserved fish caught from the river, and seasoned bread baked for kings and laborers alike. Workers building the pyramids were given salted fish and bread as part of their rations, keeping them strong through long, grueling days under the sun. Thus, salt in Egypt served both the living and the dead. It filled the kitchens of the poor and the tombs of the mighty. It was, quite literally, the salt of life and the salt of eternity. Now, let us journey east, across mountains and plains to ancient China, a land where salt would become not only a necessity, but a tool of government and empire. China's relationship with salt is among the oldest and most sophisticated in the world. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as 6,000 years ago, people along the Yangtze River were harvesting salt from springs and lakes. Over centuries, techniques grew more advanced. By the time of the Han Dynasty, salt was being extracted from underground brine wells using bamboo pipelines, a technology astonishingly ahead of its time. But what truly made China unique was the way rulers recognized salt as a source of power. The emperors declared salt a monopoly of the state. Only the government could legally produce and sell it. By controlling salt, they controlled revenue, and by controlling revenue, they strengthened the empire. Salt taxes became one of the largest sources of income for Chinese dynasties. The wealth it generated built armies, funded palaces, and supported the bureaucracy that stretched across the vast land. At times, salt revenue made up more than half of the empire's income. Imagine caravans carrying blocks of salt across dusty roads, officials inspecting cargo at checkpoints, and farmers paying their dues in crystals of white. The empire was vast, but the veins of salt tied it together. It was salt, invisible and quiet, that kept the great wheel of China's government turning. What we see in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China is not only the practical use of salt, but its transformation into a symbol of authority. Salt was the invisible hand of empire. In Mesopotamia, rulers gave salt as rations, binding workers to the state. In Egypt, priests used salt to preserve the dead, binding the people to their gods. In China, emperors monopolized salt, binding wealth to the throne. Though separated by vast distances, these early civilizations understood the same truth: whoever controlled salt controlled society. Let me share a few quiet stories, small windows into this world. In Mesopotamia, a tablet from around 2700 BCE lists the wages of workers, and alongside barley and beer, there is salt. To be paid in salt was to be paid in survival. In Egypt, records tell of vast amounts of natron being transported to tombs for royal burials. For the pharaoh, no treasure was too great if it could secure eternity. Salt, humble as it was, became more precious than jewels. And in China, an emperor of the Tang dynasty once remarked that the salt monopoly was like a great tree, one that sheltered the empire. Its branches fed the treasury, its roots supported the throne. Without salt, even the mightiest ruler would weaken. So, as you rest, let yourself picture these ancient worlds. See the shining banks of Mesopotamia, where workers scoop up salt with wooden baskets. Hear the chants of Egyptian priests, their voices low and steady, as they scatter natron upon the body of a king. Imagine the bamboo pipelines of China, carrying brine from the earth as imperial officials tally their records. Three great civilizations, each so different, yet each tied by the same shimmering crystals. Salt was not only food or faith, not only preservation or wealth, it was the silent bond between people and power. Salt in ancient empires was more than a mineral. It was the foundation upon which rulers built their authority, priests built their rituals, and common people built their daily bread. It was the invisible empire within the empire, quiet, yet stronger than walls or swords. And as we leave this chapter behind, we prepare to journey onward into the wide roads of trade. For salt did not stay hidden in rivers, deserts, or wells. It traveled. It flowed along paths across continents, and it was on those roads, the salt roads of the ancient world, that civilizations first touched each other, carrying not only goods, but stories, cultures, and dreams. Chapter 4: Salt Roads and Trade Networks. As we leave behind the great empires of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, let us follow the paths that stretched outward from their centers, the ancient roads of salt. For salt, unlike grain or fruit, did not spoil quickly. It could travel far across deserts, rivers, and mountains, and so it became one of the first great travelers of history, carried on the backs of donkeys, camels, horses, and ships. These roads of salt were not just routes of commerce. They were veins of connection, carrying not only crystals of white but also stories, languages, and cultures. Tonight we will walk these paths slowly, listening to the soft footsteps of caravans and the gentle lapping of boats, and see how salt created the world's earliest networks. Let us begin in ancient Rome. The Romans, famous for their roads, built one that bore salt's name itself, the Via Salaria, or Salt Road. This road stretched from the Adriatic coast, where salt was harvested, into the heart of Rome. Imagine a line of wagons rattling along, carrying sacks of salt into the bustling capital. The Via Salaria fed not only Rome itself, but also its legions. Soldiers on the move required rations that would not rot, and salted meat and fish became their companions on long campaigns. Even the word salary, as we've whispered before, recalls this road. Roman soldiers were partly paid in salt, or given allowances to buy it. The salt road was not just a path of trade, it was the lifeline of the empire's armies, stretching its reach across Europe and beyond. Walk with me in your imagination. The road is straight, paved with heavy stones, lined with pine trees. Dust rises under the hooves of horses, and the carts creak as they roll. Merchants exchange greetings, soldiers march in rhythm, and in the distance the sun glimmers on the white sacks tied at the back of wagons. This is the heartbeat of Rome, carried on the salt road. Now let us journey south, across the golden sands of the Sahara. Here, salt became more precious than gold itself. In West Africa, great empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai rose upon the wealth of trade. The north of the desert had vast salt mines, places like Takhaza and Taoudeni, where men cut huge slabs of salt from the earth, glistening white under the sun. To the south, across the desert, lay lands rich in gold. And so, caravans formed, endless lines of camels, sometimes thousands at a time, each carrying heavy blocks of salt strapped to their sides. These caravans walked for weeks, even months, across the Sahara, guided only by the stars and the whispers of desert winds. Picture it, a silent night in the desert, the sky filled with more stars than you have ever seen. The camels move slowly, their bells jingling softly. The traders wrap themselves in cloth against the cold night air, their faces hidden. Behind them lies the mine, ahead the markets of Timbuktu, Gao, or Kano. When the salt reached the great markets of West Africa, it was exchanged for gold, ivory, spices, and slaves. In some moments of history, a pound of salt could equal a pound of gold. Salt did not just cross the desert, it linked entire worlds. Beyond Rome, across medieval Europe, salt roads crisscrossed the land. In Germany, salt from mines in places like Halle and Lüneburg was carried by cart and river barge to distant towns. These roads grew so important that they shaped politics, giving rise to the powerful Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading cities along the Baltic and North Sea. Salt allowed fish, especially herring, to be preserved, feeding entire populations through long winters. Imagine a medieval road in Europe, muddy, winding, passing through forests and villages. A line of ox-drawn carts moves slowly, piled high with wooden barrels filled with salted fish. In the villages along the way, children run to watch the merchants pass, hoping for a story of distant cities. Salt, quiet and unassuming, is the treasure within those barrels, keeping food alive through the coldest months. Salt also found its place on the famous Silk Roads of Asia. While silk, spices, and jade dazzled traders and historians alike, salt was the quiet companion that sustained caravans across vast distances. Salt from Chinese wells traveled westward, traded for horses, furs, and silver. In return, exotic goods from Persia and India flowed east. Salt rarely drew the same attention as silk or gold, yet without it, long journeys would have been impossible. Travelers needed it to season their food, to preserve meat, to feed their animals. It was, in many ways, the hidden currency of the Silk Roads. Not all salt traveled by land. The sea, too, became a salt road. In the Mediterranean, ships carried salt harvested from coastal pans to islands and ports. Venice, that glittering city on the water, built much of its early wealth not only on spice, but also on salt. Venetian merchants controlled salt supplies from the Adriatic and beyond, using them to dominate trade routes for centuries. Farther east, Chinese junks carried salt across the seas of Asia, while Arab dhows sailed with salt along the Indian Ocean, connecting Africa, Arabia, and India. Picture yourself standing on a wooden dock. A ship sways gently in the tide. Workers carry baskets of white crystals, pouring them into the hold. The air smells of salt water and wood. Soon, the sails will rise, and the ship will carry its quiet cargo across the horizon. The roads as highways of culture. But these salt roads were not only about trade, they were also highways of culture. Along the Via Salaria, Latin words spread. Along the Saharan caravans, Islam, with its prayers and books, crossed into West Africa. Along the Hanseatic salt routes, ideas of law, art, and music traveled with barrels of fish. Salt was the excuse for the journey. Culture was the gift carried along the way. The hardship of travel. Of course, these journeys were not easy. Traders risked robbery, storms, hunger, and thirst. A caravan crossing the Sahara could lose many camels, even men, to heat and exhaustion. A ship on the Mediterranean could be taken by pirates. A cart along a muddy European road could be trapped for days. Yet still they came, always moving, because the demand for salt never ended. Every family needed it. Every soldier required it. Every ruler taxed it. And so, despite danger and hardship, the salt roads remained open, century after century. As you lie here, drifting deeper into rest, imagine the world long ago. See the straight Roman roads lined with wagons. Feel the endless sand of the Sahara under the moonlight. Hear the creak of medieval carts in a German forest. Smell the salt air of a Venetian port. All of these places, so different, were linked by one thing: the need for salt. The roads may have been long, the journeys hard, but they bound the world together. Salt roads and trade networks were the first threads of globalization. They carried not only goods, but also connections. They allowed empires to feed their armies, families to survive the winter, and distant peoples to meet one another. Salt was not the loudest traveler, nor the most glamorous, yet without it, many journeys would never have been possible. And now, as we leave the roads behind, let us step into the next chapter to see how salt, once carried along roads and rivers, became the very source of wealth and power itself. Chapter 5: Salt, Wealth and Power. We have walked along the salt roads and watched caravans and ships carry their quiet treasure across the world. Now let us pause to reflect on what salt truly meant to those who controlled it. For salt was never only food or trade. It was wealth. It was influence. It was power itself. To own salt was to own life. To tax it was to tax every meal, every family, every soldier. Rulers soon understood this, and salt became one of the most powerful tools of governance in history. Tonight, we will drift gently through the halls of kings, the vaults of merchants, and the struggles of common people to see how salt shaped the rise and fall of wealth and power. The universal demand. The first thing to remember is this: everyone needed salt. A rich man in a palace might dine on roasted meats, fruits, and wine, while a poor farmer ate little more than bread and broth. Yet both required salt. Unlike spices or luxuries, salt was not optional. It was essential for survival. This universal demand gave rulers an opportunity. By taxing salt, they could ensure a steady flow of revenue that touched every household. By controlling its trade, they could secure loyalty, fund armies, and build cities. And by monopolizing salt, they could weaken rivals and strengthen their own power. Salt was, in many ways, the most democratic of all commodities. Everyone needed it, and therefore everyone paid for it. Merchants and the birth of fortunes. In the early markets of Europe and Asia, salt created merchants of immense wealth. In Venice, salt from the Adriatic was stored in vast warehouses, guarded carefully by the city's leaders. Venetian traders sold it at high prices across the Mediterranean, their ships moving steadily like white-winged messengers. The profits from salt helped build Venice's navy, its palaces, and its reputation as one of the richest cities of the medieval world. In Germany, merchants in towns like Lüneburg and Halle grew rich from salt mines that had been dug deep into the earth. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of trading cities, used salt as a foundation for their wealth. By controlling the salted fish trade, they fed much of northern Europe. Imagine a merchant of that time, his ledger filled with figures, his ships loaded with barrels of salted herring, his house decorated with fine cloth and silver. All of it came from the simple trade of salt. Salt turned humble traders into wealthy elites and wealthy elites into political forces. Salt and the crown rulers quickly realized that salt could be their greatest ally. To tax salt was to gather wealth from all corners of their realm. To control salt was to control life. In France, a tax known as the gabelle was placed upon salt. Every person was required by law to buy a certain amount of taxed salt each year. Even if one needed little, one still had to pay. The burden of this tax fell most heavily on the poor, and resentment brewed. In time, anger at the gabelle became one of the sparks that fed the French Revolution. In China, as we have seen, the emperors built an entire monopoly upon salt, drawing more than half their revenue from it at times. This wealth allowed dynasties to maintain large armies, build the Great Wall, and govern vast territories. In England, kings levied duties on imported salt, filling their treasuries with revenue. Salt duties helped fund wars and royal expenses, even as they burdened the common people. From Europe to Asia, salt became a quiet crown jewel in the treasuries of kings. Salt and wars, salt even shaped wars. To deny salt to an enemy was to weaken their armies and starve their people. During medieval sieges, armies would sometimes cut off salt supplies to the city they besieged, knowing that hunger and weakness would force surrender. In the American Revolutionary War, British blockades sought to deny salt to the colonies, making it difficult for soldiers to preserve meat. Without salt, armies could not march. Soldiers without food could not fight. Thus, salt was not only a commodity of peace, but a weapon of war. Salt and rebellions. But just as salt enriched rulers, it also provoked rebellion. Wherever salt was heavily taxed, resentment grew. In France, smugglers known as faux sauniers carried untaxed salt at night, risking prison or execution. Entire underground networks formed to resist the gabelle. In China, illegal salt production thrived despite the monopoly. Smugglers carried hidden sacks along rivers and through forests, bribing officials or fleeing from them. At times, salt smuggling became so widespread that it threatened the stability of the empire. Even in India, centuries later, salt would spark resistance. When Mahatma Gandhi marched to the sea to make salt in defiance of British law, he was walking in the footsteps of countless generations who had resisted salt monopolies before him. Salt, so small and ordinary, became the rallying cry of freedom. The symbol of wealth, beyond its economic power, salt also became a symbol of wealth and prestige. To serve richly salted dishes was to show one's prosperity. In medieval banquets, salt was placed in ornate containers called salt cellars, often made of silver or gold. Where you sat in relation to the salt cellar at a banquet reflected your social status. The honored guests sat above the salt, while lesser ones sat below the salt. Imagine a great hall lit by torches. Long tables are filled with nobles, knights, and merchants. At the center, near the lord of the manor, sits a gleaming salt cellar, carved, decorated, filled with pure white crystals. To sit near it is to sit near power. Salt was not only food or tax, it was a symbol, a marker of status, a reminder that this small mineral carried weight far greater than its size. The paradox of salt. And so, salt reveals a paradox. It was humble, common, needed by all. Yet it was also royal, powerful, a tool of kings. It enriched merchants and crowned empires, but it also burdened peasants and sparked revolts. Salt was at once a unifier and a divider. It joined people through trade but separated them through taxes. It gave life, yet it could also bring hardship. As you listen, let yourself drift into those old worlds. Picture the warehouses of Venice, filled with sacks of salt. Imagine the French countryside, where peasants muttered angrily about the gabelle. See the smuggler moving quietly at night, carrying salt along a hidden path. Salt flowed like a river of wealth, touching kings, merchants, and peasants alike. Its quiet presence shaped politics, economies, and revolutions. It was not merely seasoning, it was the very stuff of power. Salt, wealth, and power were inseparable in history. From the tax collectors of China to the treasuries of France, from the halls of Venice to the battlefields of America, salt built fortunes and funded thrones. Yet at the same time, it sowed seeds of discontent and rebellion. As we leave this chapter behind, let us walk onward into one of the greatest empires of history, Rome. There, salt did not only feed armies and fund the state, it gave birth to the very word we use today for our wages. In the next chapter, we will see how the Roman Empire rose and endured, carried forward by the strength of salt. Chapter 6: Salt and the Roman Empire. We now step into the world of Rome, one of the greatest empires in history, a power whose roads, laws, and language still echo through time. Rome was a city of stone and marble, of legions and senators, of triumphs and tragedies. Yet beneath all the grandeur, Rome too was bound by salt. For the Romans, salt was not only a necessity of life, but a foundation of wealth, military might, and cultural identity. It touched the soldiers' pay, the markets of the capital, the laws of the empire, and the very roads that stretched across Europe. Tonight, let us walk slowly through Rome's salt-scented past and see how this humble mineral helped sustain an empire. The Via Salaria. The Salt Road. Let us begin with the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. This ancient road led from the salt pans of Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber River, into the heart of Rome itself. It was one of the first great Roman roads, and like veins feeding a body, it carried salt steadily into the city. Picture it: carts drawn by oxen creak along the stone-paved road, sacks of white crystals jostle with each step. The sun shines on the river, and in the distance, Rome's walls rise like a promise. This road was not only a route of commerce, but also a symbol of Rome's organization, discipline, and reach. The Via Salaria connected Rome to its hinterlands and beyond, supplying not just the capital but also the legions who guarded the empire's borders. It was a road of sustenance, and Rome's power depended on it. The salary of soldiers. The word salary comes directly from salt. Roman soldiers were given an allowance called the salarium, which ensured they could buy salt for themselves and their families. Salt was essential for soldiers, who marched long distances and fought under the sun. Their bodies needed salt to survive the heat and strain, and their food needed salt to last through campaigns. Imagine a Roman legion on the move, thousands of men marching in formation, their armor gleaming, their footsteps pounding like thunder on the earth. Behind them, wagons carry supplies, bread, meat, wine, and always salt. The soldiers' endurance, their ability to march further than their enemies, was made possible by this simple mineral. Salt, in a quiet way, was a weapon of war. Without it, Rome's armies would have withered. With it, they became unstoppable. Salt in Roman daily life. In the bustling streets of Rome, salt was everywhere. Vendors sold salted olives, fish, and meats in the marketplaces. Salt was sprinkled on bread, used in sauces, and added to wine to give it flavor. The Romans believed salt was healthy and used it in medicine, offering it to heal wounds, calm stomachs, and purify the body. In religious rituals, salt was sacred. Priests sprinkled it on sacrifices to honor the gods, believing it purified offerings and made them pleasing to divine eyes. A Roman meal often began with a ritual pinch of salt, a gesture that turned eating into an act of reverence. Even in language, salt left its trace. The Latin phrase sal sapit omnia, salt gives flavor to everything, reflected not only food, but also life itself. To be witty was to be salty, full of spark and humor. Salt was woven into every layer of Roman life, from the soldier's ration to the poet's metaphor. Salt storage and trade. The empire stretched across vast lands, from Britain in the west to the deserts of the east, and everywhere salt was needed. To meet this demand, Rome built granaries and salt storehouses where large reserves were kept. These warehouses were guarded closely, for salt was too precious to be left unprotected. Salt was traded across the empire. Mines in Italy, Spain, and Gaul fed the markets. Coastal salt pans along the Mediterranean glistened in the sun, their waters evaporated to leave behind the crystals. Salt flowed along rivers and roads, feeding the appetite of the empire. Merchants became wealthy, tax collectors filled their ledgers, and the empire strengthened its grip through the steady, silent trade of salt. Salt as law and control. Rome, like other empires, also understood the political power of salt. By taxing it, rulers filled their coffers. By controlling its distribution, they ensured loyalty. Salt became a tool of governance, binding people to the empire. One law required that all communities provide salt for the army when demanded. Another gave the state power over certain salt works, ensuring steady revenue. Salt was not left to chance. It was managed, measured, and enforced. Thus, salt was not only a food, but also a form of law. To live under Rome was to live under its salt. Salt in Roman belief and symbolism. Salt was not just practical, it was symbolic. It stood for loyalty, friendship, and permanence. To share salt with someone was to form a bond of trust. To break that bond was unthinkable. At Roman feasts, salt was passed carefully from host to guest. To spill salt was seen as bad luck, an omen that a friendship or agreement might be broken. Even today, when we toss a pinch of salt over the shoulder to chase away misfortune, we echo the beliefs of the Romans. Salt was also tied to the idea of empire itself. Just as salt preserved food, Rome preserved order. Just as salt flavored life, Rome flavored the world with its culture. Salt was the metaphor for Rome's mission: to endure, to enrich, to hold together. Salt in Rome's decline. Yet even Rome, mighty as it was, faced troubles tied to salt. As the empire expanded, demands for salt grew heavier. Supplying distant legions became harder, and trade routes stretched thin. Taxes on salt meant to fund the treasury, sometimes burdened the poor, fueling resentment. Smuggling and corruption grew. And when Rome began to weaken, salt supplies faltered too. Armies could not be fed as efficiently, merchants lost profits, and the empire's grip loosened. Salt, once a pillar of strength, became a mirror of Rome's fragility. As you drift in your thoughts, imagine Rome at its height, the straight lines of the Via Salaria stretching like veins of stone through the countryside, soldiers receiving their salarium, their wages of salt before marching to distant lands, a bustling market where vendors call out, offering salted fish, olives, and bread to hungry citizens, priests sprinkling salt on altars, the crystals gleaming in lamplight as prayers rise to the gods. And finally, picture the decline, the roads less travelled, the warehouses less full, the soldiers less steady. Salt, as always, was there, reflecting Rome's rise, its glory, and its slow fall. Salt in the Roman Empire was not a small detail of history. It was the lifeblood of armies, the foundation of trade, the tool of governance, and the symbol of loyalty. It flavored Rome's food, honored Rome's gods, and paid Rome's soldiers. Without salt, the empire could not have endured as it did. And with salt, it left us a legacy that lingers even in our words, in every salary paid, in every pinch of salt shared. As we leave Rome behind, let us walk eastward into the deserts of Africa and the golden age of Islam, where salt would once again flow across great caravans, feeding empires, markets, and cultures. For salt was not finished with history, it was only beginning new journeys. Chapter 7. Salt in the Islamic Golden Age. The Roman Empire has faded, its legions quiet, its roads now walked by new peoples. In its place, across deserts and seas, another civilization begins to shine, the Islamic world. From the 7th century onward, a great flourishing of knowledge, trade, art and science spread from Arabia to Spain, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa and Asia. This was the Islamic Golden Age, and within it, salt once again played its quiet, essential role. It was not only food, not only preservation, it was wealth, power, and culture. In this age of caravans and caliphs, of scholars and merchants, salt flowed like a river of white crystals across golden sands. Tonight we will walk softly into this world and see how salt shaped its empires and markets, the desert mines. Let us begin deep in the Sahara. Here, under the blazing sun, lay the salt mines of Tagaza and Taoudeni in what is today Mali. These were no ordinary mines. They were vast pits where men cut great slabs of salt, each the size of a paving stone. The crystals shone blinding white against the desert sand. For the workers, life was harsh. They labored in extreme heat, often with little water, surrounded by nothing but endless horizon. Yet their labor fed empires. From these mines, salt was carried north and south across the desert. To the north, it fed the markets of North Africa and the Mediterranean. To the south, it fed the growing empires of West Africa. The mines were so valuable that wars were fought over them. Whoever controlled Tagaza and Taoudeni controlled wealth beyond measure. In those days, people said that in parts of Africa, salt was worth its weight in gold. Caravans of the Sahara. From the mines, salt traveled across the Sahara in immense caravans. These caravans were legendary. Thousands of camels, each carrying 2 great slabs of salt tied to their sides. Picture it, a line of camels stretching across the desert as far as the eye can see. The sun is high, the sand is blinding, and the only sound is the soft shuffle of hooves and the jingle of camel bells. Traders wrapped in indigo cloth walk beside their animals, their faces shielded from the sun. At night, under skies filled with stars, the caravan rests. Fires flicker, tea is brewed, and the blocks of salt lie silent, waiting for their long journey to resume. These caravans could take weeks, even months, to cross the desert. Some perished in sandstorms, others were attacked by raiders, yet still they came, for the reward was too great. Salt was the lifeblood of trade, and the caravans were its veins. Timbuktu, the city of salt and knowledge. Where did the caravans lead? To the markets of great cities, and none greater than Timbuktu. Timbuktu, in the Empire of Mali, became famous as a crossroads of trade and learning. Here, salt from the Sahara was exchanged for gold from the forests to the south, ivory from the rivers, and slaves from distant lands. In the markets, traders stacked slabs of salt like walls. Buyers tested the crystals, broke off pieces, tasted them. Gold dust was measured in return, poured carefully into leather pouches. In this city, salt was not just food, it was money. But Timbuktu was not only a market, it was also a center of learning. Scholars gathered in its libraries, writing books on science, medicine, astronomy, and religion. And so, along with salt and gold, knowledge flowed through Timbuktu's gates. Imagine walking its streets, merchants shouting their prices, scholars debating under shady trees, camels resting after long journeys. The air is filled with the smell of spices, the sound of prayers, and the glimmer of salt stacked high in the sun. Salt across the Islamic world. From North Africa, salt travelled further still. Arab merchants carried it across the Mediterranean into Europe. Along the Indian Ocean, dhows with triangular sails carried salt to Arabia, India, and beyond. In cities like Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus, salt was a staple of daily life. It flavoured stews, preserved fish and meat, and was sold in bustling souks alongside spices and cloth. In these great cities, salt was both ordinary and extraordinary, humble enough to sit in every kitchen, yet valuable enough to fill the purses of rulers. The caliphs understood its importance. Taxes were levied on salt, markets were regulated, and merchants grew wealthy under the steady demand. Salt was not only part of the economy, it was part of governance, part of stability. Salt and faith. Salt also found a place in the faith and traditions of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad is said to have advised beginning and ending meals with salt, considering it a purifier of the body. In some regions, salt was shared at weddings and gatherings, symbolizing trust and loyalty between families. Across the Islamic world, salt was a reminder of both the earth's bounty and God's provision. It was ordinary, yes, but it was also a blessing. Salt and empires of West Africa. The wealth of salt also fed the rise of West African empires, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The kings of these lands grew rich by taxing salt as it passed through their territory. Caravans arriving from the Sahara paid heavily at checkpoints. The gold from the south and the salt from the north met in their cities, and their coffers overflowed. One famous king, Mansa Musa of Mali, is remembered as one of the richest men in history. His empire's wealth came largely from the trade of salt and gold. When he travelled to Mecca on pilgrimage in the 14th century, he carried so much gold that its value fell in Egypt for years. Behind his glittering journey was the steady, silent wealth of salt. Cultural bridges of salt was more than trade. It was also a bridge of culture. Along the caravans and markets, Arabic blended with African languages. Islamic law and scholarship spread alongside trade. Mosques rose in desert towns, their minarets pointing like fingers to the sky. Salt was the reason the caravans walked, but ideas were the treasures they carried with them. Without salt, the bridges of culture would have been weaker, slower. With salt, they stretched far and wide. As you listen, let yourself imagine this golden age, the endless desert where caravans march like rivers of life, the mines of Taghaza echoing with the sound of hammers on stone, the markets of Timbuktu piled with slabs of white that glitter like treasure, the libraries where scholars write by lamplight as traders outside haggle over salt and gold. This was a world where salt was more than food. It was money, it was empire, it was faith, and it was knowledge. Salt in the Islamic Golden Age was the lifeblood of trade, the foundation of cities, and the partner of knowledge. It built Timbuktu into a beacon of learning. It enriched kings and merchants. It tied Africa, Arabia, and Asia into a single web of exchange. As we leave the golden sands of the Sahara, let us journey further east to another great land shaped by salt, Asia. In China, India, and beyond, salt would continue its story, becoming one of the most important commodities in the world. Chapter 8: Salt in Asia. We now turn our gaze eastward across deserts and mountains into the vast lands of Asia. Here, salt was more than a simple mineral. It was the quiet heartbeat of dynasties, a symbol of purity in rituals, a treasure of merchants, and in time, the spark of revolutions. From the sacred rivers of India to the bamboo pipelines of China, from the Himalayan passes to the shores of Japan, salt carried the same dual nature it held everywhere. It nourished the body, but it also built the wealth of rulers. Tonight, we will drift slowly through these lands, seeing how salt shaped the destiny of Asia. India, the sacred crystal. Let us begin in India, a land of rivers, temples, and empires. Salt here was not only food, it was sacred. For centuries, Indians gathered salt from the sea and from inland deposits. Along the coast, villagers harvested it by letting seawater evaporate in pans under the hot sun. leaving behind shining crusts of white. Inland, salt lakes such as Sampar in Rajasthan became centers of production, their waters thick with mineral wealth. But salt was more than survival. In Hindu tradition, salt held symbolic meaning. It was used in offerings to the gods, in rituals of purification, and in ceremonies marking births and marriages. To share salt was to share loyalty, to seal a bond of trust. In Ayurveda, the ancient Indian system of medicine, salt was described as one of the essential tastes of life, balancing the body and aiding digestion. Physicians prescribed it not only for flavor but for healing, believing it carried the energy of the earth. Salt also shaped India's politics. Rulers taxed it heavily, knowing every household required it. Centuries later, British colonizers would enforce strict monopolies on salt, forbidding Indians from making their own. It was this injustice that Mahatma Gandhi would challenge in his famous Salt March, a moment we will explore in a later chapter. For now, picture India's salt fields, wide, shallow pans glittering under the sun, workers scraping crystals into piles, carts creaking along dusty roads. This humble labor was the foundation of empires. China, the first great monopoly. Now let us journey to China, where salt became one of the most carefully managed resources in history. For thousands of years, the Chinese harvested salt from coastal pans, salt lakes, and brine wells. By the Han Dynasty, more than 2,000 years ago, the state had already recognized its importance. The emperors declared salt a monopoly of the crown, making it one of the pillars of their economy. Salt revenues became enormous. At times, they provided more than half of the government's income. This money funded armies, built walls, and supported the vast bureaucracy that governed the empire. The Chinese were also innovators. In Sichuan, engineers developed advanced methods of drilling brine wells and piping the salty water to the surface through bamboo tubes. Fires fueled by natural gas, also drawn from underground, were used to evaporate the brine and leave behind pure salt. This technology was centuries ahead of its time, a marvel of engineering long before Europe had discovered similar methods. But the monopoly was not without problems. Taxes on salt were heavy, and smuggling became widespread. Traders carried sacks of illegal salt along hidden paths, evading officials and soldiers. In times of unrest, salt rebellions broke out, threatening the stability of dynasties. Salt, once again, was both a foundation of strength and a source of weakness. It gave rulers wealth, but it also stirred the anger of the people. Salt and the Great Wall. Salt even helped build one of the most famous structures in the world, the Great Wall of China. As dynasties expanded northward to defend against nomadic tribes, they needed funds to build and maintain the massive walls. One way they raised these funds was through the salt tax. Revenues from salt sales were channeled into construction projects, feeding workers and paying soldiers. In a quiet way, every crystal of salt consumed in Chinese homes contributed to the stones stacked upon the wall. Salt was not only in the kitchens of peasants but in the very bricks of China's greatest monument. Japan, salt and the sea. Farther east in Japan, salt was drawn from the sea. Along the coasts, workers developed methods of pouring seawater over sand and then collecting the concentrated brine to evaporate. Salt became essential for preserving fish, a staple of the Japanese diet. In Shinto traditions, salt was considered purifying. It was sprinkled at shrines, at the entrances of homes, and even at the doors of shops. Sumo wrestlers threw salt into the ring before a match, a practice still alive today, symbolizing the cleansing of evil and the honoring of the sacred. Thus, salt in Japan carried both nourishment and spirituality. It fed the people, but it also sanctified their lives. The Himalayas, salt of the mountains. High in the Himalayas, salt took a different form. Here, in the rocks of ancient seas lifted by the earth's shifting plates, salt lay buried in crystal veins. For centuries, traders chipped away at these pinkish stones and carried them down winding mountain paths. This Himalayan salt was traded across India, Nepal, and Tibet, exchanged for grain, wool, and tea. Even today, blocks of Himalayan salt are prized, though now more for novelty than necessity. But in the past they were vital, the mountain's quiet gift to the valleys below. Southeast Asia, salt and empire. In Southeast Asia, too, salt shaped civilizations. In Cambodia, the ancient Khmer Empire relied on salt production from both coastal pans and inland sources to feed its people. Angkor, with its magnificent temples, depended on steady supplies of preserved fish, and that preservation required salt. Salt travelled by boat along rivers and canals, its crystals keeping entire cities alive. Without it, the splendour of Angkor could not have endured. Salt as a social divide across Asia, salt often marked the line between ruler and ruled. The wealthy could afford it with ease, while the poor felt the weight of taxes and monopolies. In many places, salt became a symbol of oppression. Yet at the same time, it was also a symbol of unity, for it bound entire societies together in shared dependence. It was a paradox. The same grain that preserved life could also fuel discontent. As you listen, let your mind wander across Asia. See the salt pans of India glittering white under a blazing sun. Hear the creak of bamboo pipelines in Sichuan carrying brine from deep within the earth. Smell the sea air of Japan, where workers pour water over sand. Feel the cool winds of the Himalayas, where traders carry heavy slabs down mountain trails. In every corner, salt was there, silent, steady, essential. It nourished millions, built dynasties, funded walls, and sanctified rituals. It was not just a mineral, it was the quiet companion of every culture. Salt in Asia was both sacred and practical, both wealth and burden. It gave rulers their revenue, priests their rituals, merchants their fortunes, and farmers their survival. It built walls, united trade routes, and even inspired revolts. As we leave Asia's vast landscapes behind, let us now turn to the struggles that salt inspired. For as rulers tightened their grip upon this humble crystal, people grew restless. In the next chapter, we will see how salt sparked riots, rebellions, and revolutions across history, moments when the people rose up against the weight of the salt tax. Chapter 9: Salt and Social Revolutions. Up until now, we have seen salt as the lifeblood of empires, enriching rulers, feeding armies, sustaining cities, and sanctifying rituals. But there is another side to this story, for just as salt gave life, it also provoked anger, resistance, and rebellion. Wherever rulers grew greedy, wherever taxes became heavy, wherever monopolies tightened their grip, salt became more than food. It became a symbol of injustice, and in many places, that symbol ignited revolutions. Tonight, let us wander through the restless streets of history and see how salt, small and white, sparked flames of revolt. France and the Gabelle. Let us begin in France, where the gabelle, a tax on salt, became one of the most hated burdens of the kingdom. By the 14th century, the French crown had declared salt a royal monopoly. Every subject was required by law to purchase a fixed amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. For poor families, this law was crushing. Salt that once cost pennies now cost many times more under the tax. Imagine a peasant family in rural France. Their table holds only coarse bread, thin soup, perhaps a little fish. They need salt to preserve food, to flavour meals, to live. But now even the smallest pinch carries the heavy weight of royal taxation. Resentment spread. Smugglers known as faux sauniers carried untaxed salt through forests and rivers, evading royal guards. These smugglers risked prison, whipping, even death, yet still they carried their sacks by moonlight. In villages, people whispered and traded salt in secret, as though it were contraband treasure. Over time, the gabelle became more than a tax. It became a symbol of royal greed. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the gabelle was one of the grievances listed in the people's cries for justice. And when the Bastille fell, it was not only kings and nobles who lost their power. The salt tax too would be swept away. Salt, once the quiet crystal on every table, had become a spark of revolution. China's salt rebellions. Now let us cross the world to China, where salt was also a royal monopoly. For centuries, the Chinese emperors declared that only the state could produce and sell salt. Taxes were collected in every village, and officials grew rich managing the trade. But where there is monopoly, there is smuggling. Across rivers and mountains, secret networks carried salt outside the reach of the state. Entire families became smugglers, hiding sacks in carts, disguising shipments, bribing guards. At times, these networks grew so strong that they rivaled the government itself. In the Tang dynasty, salt smugglers were so powerful that officials feared to challenge them. During the Ming dynasty, corruption in the salt administration became notorious, and in times of crisis, when taxes grew harsher, salt sparked open revolt. In the 9th century, a rebellion led by Huang Chao, originally a salt smuggler, nearly toppled the Tang dynasty. His armies swept across China, fueled in part by anger at salt monopolies. Salt in China was not only wealth, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Salt riots in Europe beyond France and China. Salt-inspired riots across Europe. In Italy, cities fought bitterly over control of salt works. In the 16th century, Venice and Ferrara went to war in the so-called Salt War, a conflict born from disputes over salt taxes. In Russia, the Salt Riot of 1648 erupted in Moscow after the government imposed a heavy tax on salt. The people, furious at the soaring prices, stormed the city, demanding justice. For days, the capital burned with anger. Again and again, salt was the center of unrest, not because it was exotic or rare, but because it was essential. When rulers tampered with salt, they tampered with life itself. Salt as smuggler's gold. Because salt was so heavily taxed, smuggling became a way of life in many regions. In France, smugglers carried salt along forest paths and riverbanks. In India, under British rule, villagers made secret salt by boiling seawater at night, hiding it from inspectors. These smugglers were often seen as folk heroes, champions of ordinary people against unjust rulers. To smuggle salt was not merely crime, it was resistance. Each hidden sack was an act of defiance. Salt and freedom. Salt's role in rebellion went beyond anger at taxes. It became a symbol of freedom itself. In colonial India, the British imposed strict control over salt, forbidding locals from producing it freely. The salt tax hit the poorest the hardest, just as it had in France centuries before. To protest this injustice, Mahatma Gandhi launched the Salt March of 1930, a 240-mile walk to the Arabian Sea, where he bent down, lifted a handful of salt, and declared Indian independence in that single gesture. It was a quiet act, but it shook an empire. The world watched as millions of Indians defied the salt laws, boiling seawater in pans, gathering crystals, and declaring that they would no longer bow to injustice. In Gandhi's hands, salt was transformed into a banner of freedom, a symbol as powerful as any sword or flag. Salt and social equality. Part of salt's power in revolutions came from its universality. Unlike gold or silk, salt belonged to everyone. Every family needed it, rich or poor, noble or peasant. This made salt taxes deeply felt by all, and it made salt protests unifying. In France, peasants and merchants alike hated the gabelle. In India, both rich and poor joined Gandhi's march. In Russia, nobles and townsfolk alike rioted against salt levies. Salt was the rare commodity that could bring entire societies together in shared anger. It was the quiet grain that united voices in rebellion. As you rest, imagine the scenes of these salt revolutions. Picture smugglers in the French countryside, carrying sacks by moonlight, their footsteps soft on forest paths. Imagine Chinese peasants whispering in the night, trading secret crystals in defiance of the emperor's law. See the angry crowds in Moscow, their voices rising in fury over salt taxes. And walk with Gandhi by the sea, where a simple handful of salt became the symbol of a nation's hope. Salt, so small and unassuming, could stir hearts and topple laws. It was more than food, it was power, and it was freedom. The salt and social revolutions are bound together through history. Wherever rulers pressed too hard, salt became the line people refused to cross. It fed anger in France, rebellion in China, riots in Russia, and independence in India. It is strange, perhaps, that something so ordinary could move empires. Yet that is the story of salt, humble, essential, and powerful enough to shake the world. And as we leave behind the cries of revolt, let us move gently into the age of exploration and empire. For in the next chapter, salt will sail with ships across oceans, fueling colonial ambitions and shaping the destiny of nations. Chapter 10. Salt in Colonial Times. The age of revolutions has passed, yet salt's story continues to flow into new waters. As European ships set sail across oceans, seeking wealth and empire, salt too travelled with them. No longer just a crystal in local markets or a caravan's burden across deserts, salt became part of the machinery of global expansion. In the colonial era, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, salt was everywhere. It flavoured food on long voyages, preserved fish for trade, and filled the coffers of colonial powers. But it also became tied to the darker side of history, the slave trade, the exploitation of colonies, and the struggle for independence. Tonight, let us drift calmly through these turbulent centuries and see how salt shaped the colonial world. Salt and the sea. The story of colonial salt begins at sea. Long ocean voyages required food that would not spoil. Fresh meat and fish could not last for weeks under the hot sun, but salted provisions could. Barrels of salted beef, pork, and fish became the foundation of sailors' diets. A ship without salt was a ship doomed to hunger. With it, fleets could cross the Atlantic, round the Cape of Good Hope, and sail into the Pacific. Imagine the hold of a great galleon, its wooden beams creaking, the smell of salt and brine heavy in the air. Barrels are stacked high, filled with salted cod from Newfoundland or salted beef from Ireland. These barrels are more than cargo. They are survival itself. Without them, the sailors would wither before reaching distant shores. Salt was, quite literally, the fuel of empire at sea. Salt and the slave trade. But salt was not only survival, it was also profit, and here the story darkens. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the transatlantic slave trade grew into one of history's greatest tragedies. European traders carried manufactured goods to Africa, exchanged them for enslaved men, women, and children, and then transported them across the ocean to the Americas in the horrific Middle Passage. What role did salt play? A vital one. Salted food, especially fish, sustained the ships on their long journeys. Salt also preserved the sugar, tobacco, and other goods produced on plantations by enslaved labor. In some regions, enslaved people were even forced to work in salt ponds and mines. In the Caribbean, the sun blazed over salt pans where enslaved Africans scraped crystals from the burning ground, their feet blistered, their bodies exhausted. The labor was brutal, yet the salt they gathered filled ships and markets, enriching colonial powers. Salt, once a symbol of loyalty and life, now became bound to suffering and exploitation. The Caribbean and salt ponds. The Caribbean islands, colonized by Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, became major centers of salt production. Coastal salt ponds glittered in the sunlight, their shallow waters drying into white beds of crystals. These ponds were worked by enslaved laborers who stood ankle-deep in brine, raking salt under the hot sun. The work was punishing, the air heavy with salt dust, the water stinging wounds on their skin. Yet their labor supplied Europe with one of its most precious commodities. Salt from the Caribbean not only fed local populations, but also preserved the cod and herring caught in northern waters, which in turn fed Europe's cities. Thus, salt linked the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa into a single chain of trade, a chain built on both wealth and suffering. India and the British salt monopoly salt also shaped colonial rule in India. For centuries, Indians had harvested salt from the sea and from inland lakes. It was a simple process, practiced by villagers for generations. But when the British East India Company gained power, and later when the British Crown ruled India, salt was transformed into a tool of control. The British imposed a heavy tax on salt and forbade Indians from producing it freely. Every grain was regulated, every sale monitored. Salt became a monopoly of the colonial government, enriching its treasury while burdening the poorest families. For the British, salt revenue was vital. For Indians, it was oppression. Mothers and fathers who once gathered salt from the shore now faced fines and imprisonment if they defied the law. This injustice would simmer for generations until, in the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi chose salt as the symbol of resistance. But even before Gandhi, salt in colonial India was already a mark of domination, a reminder of how empire reached even into the kitchens of the poor. Salt and global trade beyond India and the Caribbean. Salt was part of the vast web of global trade that defined the colonial era. In North America, colonists produced salt along the coast and in inland springs. Salt mines in places like New York and Louisiana became vital for preserving meat and feeding armies during the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. In Africa, European powers established control over salt-rich regions, using them to strengthen their grip on local economies. In Southeast Asia, colonial authorities taxed salt heavily, making it a reliable source of revenue. Everywhere, salt was present, ordinary, silent, but always tied to the reach of empire. Salt and revolutions. Just as in earlier times, salt in the colonial era also sparked unrest. In America, British taxes on goods, including salt, fueled resentment among colonists. During the Revolutionary War, shortages of salt made life difficult for the Continental Army, and efforts to secure supplies became part of the struggle for independence. In India, anger at the salt monopoly grew steadily. People whispered of injustice, of rulers who taxed even the poorest families' food. This quiet resentment would one day explode into open defiance during Gandhi's Salt March. Even in smaller colonies, riots over salt taxes erupted, as people refused to accept that such an essential resource could be taken from them. Salt, once again, became a symbol of resistance. As you rest, picture the colonial world. See the holds of great ships, filled with barrels of salted meat and fish, sailing across stormy seas. Hear the cries of enslaved laborers in Caribbean salt ponds, their rakes scraping against the crust of drying pans. Walk through the markets of India, where families pay heavy taxes for the salt they once gathered freely. Salt in this era was everywhere, in the food of sailors, in the treasuries of kings, in the chains of the enslaved, and in the hands of rebels. It was both survival and suffering, both wealth and injustice. Salt in the colonial era was more than a mineral. It was a foundation of empire, a companion of sailors, a burden of the poor, and a symbol of resistance. It connected continents, fueled trade, and deepened exploitation. As we leave behind the colonial world, let us step gently into the story of India once more. For in the 20th century, salt would rise again, not as a burden of empire, but as the symbol of freedom itself. In the next chapter, we will walk beside Gandhi and the people of India as they march to the sea, reclaiming salt as the banner of independence. Chapter 11. Gandhi's Salt March. Through centuries of history, salt has sustained life, built empires, and fueled revolutions. Yet few moments shine as brightly or as gently as the day when one man chose salt as the symbol of freedom. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the year 1930 he walked to the sea to defy an empire. This was not a march of armies, nor a rebellion of weapons. It was a quiet protest, built on principle, simplicity, and the power of truth. Tonight, let us walk beside Gandhi, step by step, and see how salt, small, white, and ordinary, became the crystal that cracked the British Empire's hold on India. The burden of the salt tax. For centuries, the people of India had gathered salt freely. Along the coasts, villagers harvested it by letting seawater evaporate in the sun. Inland, families collected it from lakes and deposits, passing down the craft through generations. Salt was not a luxury, it was survival, but under British rule, this freedom was taken away. The colonial government declared a monopoly over salt. Indians could not make their own. They were forced to buy it, heavily taxed, from government stores. Even the poorest family, scraping together coins for food, had to pay for this essential grain. The injustice was deep. Salt was life, and yet it was locked away behind laws and taxes. To many Indians, it felt as though the empire had reached into their very kitchens, into the meals of their children, and claimed ownership. It was this quiet injustice that Gandhi chose to challenge, Gandhi's vision. By 1930, Gandhi had already become the voice of India's independence movement. He believed in ahimsa, non-violence, and in satyagraha, the force of truth. For him, freedom was not to be won by guns or bloodshed, but by peaceful resistance, by refusing to cooperate with injustice. When he looked for a symbol to rally the nation, he chose salt. Why? Because salt belonged to everyone. Rich or poor, Hindu or Muslim, man or woman, all needed it. By striking at the salt monopoly, Gandhi struck at the very heart of colonial power, and at the same time he spoke to every Indian household. Next to air and water, he declared, salt is perhaps the greatest necessity of life. The March to the Sea. On the morning of March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out from his ashram at Sabarmati in Gujarat. He was not alone. 78 companions walked with him, men dressed in simple white khadi cloth, carrying little more than walking sticks. The plan was simple: to walk 240 miles, village by village, until they reached the Arabian Sea. There, Gandhi would bend down, lift a handful of salt, and declare independence in that small gesture. Day after day they walked. Gandhi, already 60 years old, moved steadily at the front, his bare feet touching the earth with quiet determination. Villagers lined the roads to see him. Some offered food, others joined the march. Each day the crowd grew larger. The British officials mocked it at first. What harm could come from an old man walking to the sea? But as the days passed, they began to worry. Newspapers across the world followed the march. Crowds of thousands gathered in villages and towns to see Gandhi pass. The march became more than a protest. It became a pilgrimage of freedom, the symbol of salt. On April 6, 1930, after 24 days of walking, Gandhi and his followers reached the shore at Dandi. The waves of the Arabian Sea rolled gently onto the sand. The crowd that had gathered watched in silence. Gandhi bent down, scooped up a lump of salty mud, and held it aloft. Then slowly, he boiled it, letting the water evaporate until crystals formed. With that simple act, he had broken the law. He had made salt. It was a small gesture, yet it echoed like thunder. Across India, people followed his example. Villagers boiled seawater in pots. Families gathered salt from the shore. Shopkeepers sold it openly in defiance of the law. Children played with handfuls of it, laughing as though they held treasure. Salt, once the symbol of oppression, had become the banner of freedom. The response. The British government reacted harshly. Thousands were arrested. Gandhi himself was taken to prison weeks later. Violence broke out in some places as police clashed with crowds, but Gandhi urged his followers to remain peaceful, even under attack. Despite the repression, the Salt March had already achieved its goal. It awakened the spirit of resistance across India. It showed that independence could be pursued without violence, and it captured the attention of the world, from London to New York, where newspapers printed photographs of Gandhi walking with his staff, small but unshakable against the might of empire. The global echo. What made the Salt March so powerful was not only its impact on India but also its message to the world. For centuries, salt had been a tool of rulers, a tax, a monopoly, a source of oppression, but Gandhi transformed it into a weapon of peace. By lifting a handful of salt, he reminded the world that freedom is not built on armies alone, but also on dignity, courage, and truth. The march inspired movements far beyond India. Leaders of civil rights struggles in the United States studied Gandhi's methods. Anti-colonial activists in Africa and Asia found hope in his example. Salt, in Gandhi's hands, became a universal language of justice. As you listen, imagine the scene by the sea at Dandi. The sun is rising, casting golden light on the waves. Gandhi bends slowly, his hand touching the earth. He lifts a small handful of salt, glimmering in the morning light. Around him a crowd waits, silent and breathless. Then, as the crystals fall through his fingers, a cheer rises like a wave. It is not the cheer of victory, not yet, but it is the cheer of awakening, the cheer of a people who know that freedom is within reach. The Salt March of 1930 was not a battle, yet it shook an empire. It was not loud, yet its echoes were heard across the world. Salt, humble and ordinary, became the spark of independence. As we leave Gandhi's march by the sea, let us step into a gentler chapter, into the world of culture, belief, and tradition. For salt was never only politics or power. It was also a symbol of loyalty, purity, and faith, woven into the daily rituals of humanity. In the next chapter, we will explore how salt entered myths and ceremonies, how it became a blessing at weddings, a shield against evil, and a sacred offering to the divine. Chapter 12: Salt in Culture and Beliefs. Salt has built empires, fed armies, and sparked revolutions. Yet its story is not only one of politics and trade. Salt also lives quietly in the heart of human culture, in our myths, our ceremonies, our blessings, and our superstitions. For thousands of years, people have looked at the simple white crystal and seen not just food, but meaning. They saw purity in its brightness, loyalty in its sharing, eternity in its endurance, and protection in its power. Tonight, let us wander softly through these cultural landscapes and see how salt became more than survival. It became a symbol of the human spirit. Salt as purity. In many cultures, salt has been seen as a purifier, a substance that cleanses both body and spirit. In ancient Rome, salt was sprinkled on sacrifices to the gods, ensuring that offerings were pure and acceptable. No ritual was complete without a pinch of salt. Priests believed it carried the power to ward off corruption and decay, to make the sacred truly sacred. In Japan, the Shinto tradition also embraced salt as a purifier. Small piles of salt, called morigyo, were placed at the entrances of homes, shops, and restaurants to invite good fortune and keep away evil. Even today, sumo wrestlers throw salt into the ring before a match, cleansing the space before combat. In Hindu ceremonies, salt was used in purification rituals, sprinkled with water to cleanse sacred spaces. It was seen as a symbol of the earth itself, a grounding element that protected against impurity. Everywhere, salt seemed to stand for what is clean, pure, and enduring. Salt as loyalty and trust. To share salt with someone has long been a sign of loyalty and trust. In the Middle East, a guest who ate salt with his host was bound by a bond of protection and friendship. To betray someone with whom you had shared salt was seen as a great dishonor. The Bible speaks of a covenant of salt, meaning an unbreakable agreement. Just as salt does not spoil or decay, so too was the bond meant to endure. In medieval Europe, to eat someone's salt was to live under their hospitality and protection. The act was small, but the meaning was great. Salt sealed trust. Even in language today, we hear echoes of this tradition. To say someone is worth their salt is to say they are loyal, valuable, and deserving of respect. Salt as protection. Salt was also seen as a shield against evil. In many cultures, people believed that spirits, demons, or bad luck could be driven away by salt. In parts of Europe, it was sprinkled around doorways and stables to protect against witches. In Russia, salt was placed in the pockets of children to guard them against harm. A well-known superstition that survives today is the tossing of salt over the left shoulder after spilling it. The idea is that the spilled salt might invite bad luck, but a pinch thrown over the shoulder would blind the devil waiting behind you. Though we may smile at these customs, they show how deeply people trusted salt as a silent protector, a small but powerful guardian in daily life. Salt in marriage and family. Salt also appeared in the most intimate of human moments: weddings, births, and family gatherings. In some Eastern European traditions, newlyweds were greeted with bread and salt, symbols of hospitality and prosperity. The bread represented life, and the salt ensured that life would always have flavor, loyalty, and endurance. In Jewish tradition, bread dipped in salt is eaten at the Sabbath meal, a reminder of the covenant of salt and the eternal bond with God. In parts of Africa, salt was offered to guests as a sign of honor and respect. To accept salt was to accept friendship. To refuse it was an insult. Salt, in these moments, was not just seasoning, it was a blessing. Salt in myth and legend. Salt also found its way into myth. In Greek legend, the sea god Poseidon was linked to salt, for the oceans themselves were his domain. The salt of the sea was his gift and his power. In Slavic folklore, salt was seen as a treasure equal to gold. One tale tells of a king who asked his daughters how much they loved him. The youngest replied, "As much as salt." The king, insulted by the comparison, banished her, only to discover later that life without salt was bland and empty. Realizing her wisdom, he welcomed her back, understanding that salt was as precious as love itself. In Norse myths, the giantess Audumla licked salty ice blocks to reveal the first god, Buri, hidden within. Salt here was the force that brought creation itself to life. Through myth and story, salt became a symbol of love, wisdom, and creation. Salt and eternity. Because salt preserves, keeping food from decay, it was often linked to eternity. The Egyptians used natron, a form of salt, in mummification, believing it preserved the body for the afterlife. In Christian traditions, salt was used in baptismal rites, symbolizing the eternal nature of the soul. To many cultures, salt was not just a gift of the earth, but a hint of immortality. Its ability to endure, to keep things from fading, made it a reminder of what is lasting and true. Salt in everyday sayings. Even our language carries salt's cultural echoes. To be worth your salt is to be valuable. To take something with a grain of salt is to approach it with wisdom and doubt. To salt the earth after a battle was to curse the land, preventing future growth. To sit above the salt at a banquet was to hold a place of honor. These phrases, scattered in everyday speech, are small reminders that salt was always more than food. It was meaning, woven into language itself. As you lie here, let your mind wander through these cultural landscapes. See a Shinto shrine in Japan, its steps lined with small white piles of salt. Hear the priest in Rome sprinkling salt on a sacrifice, chanting softly as the crystals fall. Picture a wedding in Eastern Europe, where a bride and groom share bread and salt, smiling as their families bless them. Salt is there in every scene, humble, simple, yet filled with meaning. Salt in culture and belief is a story of symbols. It is purity and loyalty, protection and eternity. It is love whispered in a fairy tale, a covenant sealed in scripture, a blessing shared at the family table. It is remarkable perhaps that such a small grain could hold such great meaning. But that is the secret of salt. It is ordinary, yet extraordinary. It belongs to the body, but also to the soul. As we leave behind the myths and rituals, let us return to the modern age. For salt's story is not finished. It continues in our industries, our diets, and our debates. In the next chapter, we will see how salt shapes the world today, in health, technology, and culture, as it has always done. Chapter 13. Salt in the Modern World. We have traveled far, from the dawn of civilization to the empires of Egypt and Rome, to the golden sands of Timbuktu, and to Gandhi's walk by the sea. Yet salt's story does not end in the past. It continues today, quietly but powerfully, in the world around us. Salt is still with us, in our food, in our industries, in our medicines, and even in our debates about health. It is mined by machines, carried in ships, scattered on icy roads, and sprinkled on dinner tables. It is both ordinary and extraordinary, as humble as the shaker beside your stove, and as vast as the oceans themselves. Tonight, let us walk calmly into the modern age and see how salt continues its journey in our world. Salt in industry. When we think of salt today, we often think of food, but in truth, the majority of salt used in the modern world does not end up on our plates. It goes to industry. Salt is used in the making of glass, paper, plastics, textiles, detergents, and soaps. It is vital in chemical production, especially in creating chlorine and caustic soda, which in turn are used to make thousands of products we touch every day. It also keeps our roads safe in winter. In snowy countries, millions of tons of salt are spread on highways to melt ice, preventing accidents and keeping trade and travel moving. The same crystals that once preserved fish for Roman soldiers now preserve lives on modern roads. Imagine a factory humming with machines, where salt is transformed into chemicals and materials. Imagine a truck spreading salt across a frozen highway, the crystals crunching beneath its tires. These are the unseen lives of salt in the modern world, silent, essential, and often unnoticed. Salt in food. Of course, salt still remains a cornerstone of our diet. It seasons food, enhances flavor, and preserves freshness. From the simplest meal of bread and butter to the most complex gourmet dish, salt is there, unlocking taste. Cheese, pickles, cured meats, and countless other foods would not exist without salt. In Japan, soy sauce, a staple of cuisine, relies on salt for fermentation. In Europe, traditional hams and sausages are cured with it. In the Middle East, olives rest in salty brine before they reach the table. Without salt, our foods would be dull, flat, and fleeting. With it, they come alive with flavor. Salt and health. Yet salt today also carries a shadow, the debate about health. Modern diets, especially in industrialized nations, often contain too much salt. Processed foods, snacks, fast meals, and canned goods are filled with it. Doctors warn of the risks of high blood pressure, heart disease, and strokes linked to excess salt. At the same time, too little salt is also harmful, for our bodies need it to regulate fluids, nerves, and muscles. The balance is delicate. Public health campaigns across the world now encourage moderation, not the elimination of salt, but its mindful use. Governments require labels on foods, and chefs seek new ways to balance flavor without overwhelming with sodium. Salt, once scarce and precious, is now abundant, and in some places, too abundant for our health. Varieties of salt. In the modern world, salt is also celebrated for its variety. Beyond ordinary table salt, there is sea salt, harvested from evaporated seawater. There is kosher salt, valued for its purity and texture in cooking. There are colorful salts from around the world: pink Himalayan salt, black volcanic salt, red Hawaiian salt. Each variety carries its own story. Himalayan salt, formed from ancient seas trapped in stone, is sold as both a seasoning and as glowing salt lamps. Fleur de sel, flower of salt, is hand-harvested from salt ponds in France, prized for its delicate crystals. Salt, even today, inspires fascination. It is not just seasoning, it is culture, craft, and tradition. Salt and culture. Today, salt's cultural role continues in our time. In sports, to be salty is to be sharp-tongued or bitter, echoing the ancient link between salt and wit. In literature and film, salt still symbolizes loyalty, honesty, or endurance. In some traditions, salt is thrown on stages before performances to bring good luck. In others, it is carried in pockets for protection. Even now, at weddings in parts of Eastern Europe, bread and salt are offered to the couple as a blessing for their new life. Salt, in small rituals, remains a part of our shared humanity. Salt and the environment. Modern salt also raises environmental questions. The mining of rock salt can scar landscapes, and the runoff of road salt into rivers can harm ecosystems. Scientists study ways to reduce its impact, to find alternatives that protect both people and nature. At the same time, salt reminds us of our planet's vastness. The oceans contain unimaginable quantities of it, a reminder of Earth's ancient history. Desalination plants, which remove salt from seawater, now provide fresh water to millions in arid regions, turning the gift of the sea into a lifeline once more. Salt in global economics. Salt may no longer be taxed as fiercely as in the past, but it remains an economic force. Nations mine and export millions of tons each year. Some countries like China, the United States, and India dominate production. In poorer regions, families still harvest salt by hand, just as their ancestors did. Along the coasts of Senegal, India, and Vietnam, workers scrape salt from pans under the same sun that shone on their forebears. For them, salt is not only heritage, but livelihood. The global trade of salt continues, quieter now, but steady, a reminder that this ancient crystal has never lost its place in human life. As you listen, imagine salt in the modern world. See the vast mines of Canada, where machines dig deep into the earth for rock salt. Hear the sound of a truck scattering crystals across a frozen highway, saving drivers from skidding on ice. Picture the bright pans of fleur de sel in France, where workers bend to collect delicate crystals by hand. Smell the aroma of fresh bread, sprinkled with a pinch of sea salt before it is served. Salt surrounds us still, in our food, in our industries, in our rituals, and even in our debates about health and environment. It is everywhere, yet often invisible. Salt in the modern world is a paradox, just as it was in the past. It is both ordinary and extraordinary, both friend and risk, both heritage and industry. It continues to nourish us, to protect us, to challenge us. The story of salt is not finished. As we look toward the future, new questions emerge. How will we manage the salt of the oceans? How will we balance health with taste? How will salt continue to inspire meaning in our lives? In the next chapter, let us drift gently into the future, imagining how salt will shape not only our kitchens and industries, but also our relationship with the earth itself. Chapter 14. Salt and the Future. We have journeyed far through the deserts of Africa, the markets of Rome, the palaces of China, and the shores of India. We have seen salt as survival, wealth, power, and rebellion. Yet the story of salt does not end in the past. It stretches forward into tomorrow, into the unknown future that lies before us. Salt is still here, silent and steady, waiting in the oceans, in the rocks, in the air we breathe. It will continue to walk with humanity, shaping our choices, our struggles, and our dreams. Tonight, let us wander softly into that future, imagining how salt may guide us in the centuries to come. The oceans and desalination. The Earth's oceans contain almost 50 million billion tons of salt, a number so vast it is almost impossible to imagine. For thousands of years, this salt has been too abundant to matter. But today, in a world where fresh water is growing scarce, the salt of the sea has become both a challenge and a promise. In many regions, rivers run dry and rainfall is uncertain. Cities thirst, farmers struggle, and nations look to the oceans. Desalination plants, which remove salt from seawater, are spreading across the globe. In the Middle East, in California, in Australia, desalination now provides fresh drinking water to millions. Imagine the process: seawater flowing into vast tanks, filters and membranes separating salt from liquid, pure water pouring forth into pipes and cities. The leftover brine, dense with salt, flows back to the sea. Desalination is costly, energy-heavy, and not without risks to marine life. But as the future unfolds, it may become one of humanity's greatest tools of survival. Once, salt preserved fish for soldiers. Tomorrow, the removal of salt may preserve life for entire nations. Salt and climate change. Salt will also play a role in the story of climate change. Rising seas, driven by melting ice, bring salt water into places where it does not belong. Croplands near coasts grow salty, losing their fertility. Freshwater aquifers, hidden beneath the ground, become tainted with brine. For farmers, this is a new kind of battle, not against drought or flood, but against the slow creep of salt into their fields. Scientists work to develop crops that can survive in salty soil, resilient plants that may feed future generations. And yet even here, salt teaches balance. The same mineral that nourishes life in small amounts can also overwhelm it in excess. It is a reminder that nature itself is a delicate measure, a recipe that must not be disturbed. Salt and technology. Beyond water and food, salt also whispers into the world of technology. Scientists are exploring how salt can be used in energy storage, creating molten salt batteries that hold vast amounts of power for solar plants. In these systems, salt is heated to extreme temperatures, storing energy from the sun during the day and releasing it at night, keeping lights burning even when the sky grows dark. Salt, in this vision, becomes not just a preservative of food, but a preservative of light itself. Elsewhere, researchers experiment with salt in new materials, medicines, and chemical processes. The humble crystal continues to surprise us, revealing possibilities hidden within its structure. Who knows what new roles salt may play in the centuries ahead? Perhaps in spacecraft, where recycling every drop of water and grain of salt is vital. Perhaps in technologies we cannot yet imagine, salt and human health. In the future, salt will also remain part of the conversation about human health. Already, doctors warn of too much sodium in modern diets. Researchers seek ways to create salt substitutes to balance flavor with well-being. At the same time, salt therapies are growing in popularity. Salt rooms, where people sit surrounded by salt crystals, are believed to ease breathing and calm the mind. While the science is debated, the symbolism remains strong. Salt as a healer, a purifier, a reminder of the earth's gifts. In the kitchens of tomorrow, chefs may experiment with new salts, harvested from deep seas or crafted through technology. The balance of taste and health will continue to be a dance humanity must master. Salt as symbol salt will also endure as a symbol. It may no longer spark revolutions or fund empires, but it will remain a metaphor for endurance, loyalty, and wisdom. To be the salt of the earth will always mean to be pure, honest, and essential. To take with a grain of salt will always remind us of skepticism. Salt, even in words, will continue to flavor our thoughts. Perhaps in the future, when humanity steps onto new worlds, carrying seeds and water, they will also carry salt, a reminder of earth, of meals shared, of rituals ancient and timeless. Salt may become the first seasoning on Mars, a bridge from one planet to another. Salt and human connection. Perhaps the most important role of salt in the future will be the same as in the past, to bring people together. Imagine a table in a distant time, perhaps not on Earth, but in a colony far away. People gather, tired from their work, and they share food. A pinch of salt is sprinkled on the meal, and suddenly the flavors awaken. Laughter rises, stories are told, bonds are formed. Salt will remain the companion of community, the quiet crystal that turns eating into sharing and sharing into belonging. As you rest, imagine the salt of the future. See the great desalination plants by the sea, humming as they turn salt water into fresh life. Picture vast solar farms where molten salt holds the power of the sun until night falls. Walk through markets where new varieties of salt are sold, glittering like gems. And imagine a meal on a distant planet where settlers sprinkle earth salt onto their food and smile, remembering home. Salt, timeless and unchanging, will travel with us into whatever future awaits. Salt and the future is a story still unwritten. It is a story of oceans and deserts, of energy and health, of symbolism and community. It is a reminder that even the smallest grain can carry the weight of destiny. As we close this chapter, let us prepare to drift into the conclusion of our long journey. For now, we have walked through time itself, from the dawn of civilization to the future yet to come. And in every age, salt has been there, silent but essential. In our final chapter, we will reflect on the entire journey, on how salt built and destroyed empires, preserved life, inspired myths, and still flavors our world today. And as we close our eyes, we will let salt's quiet story carry us into gentle rest. And now, my friend, we have reached the end of our long journey. We have walked through deserts and across mountains, sailed on ships and marched beside armies, sat at royal banquets and joined quiet family meals. At every step, salt was there, small, white, glimmering, yet powerful enough to shape history itself. Salt was never loud, never flashy like gold or silk. It did not glitter like jewels or shine like silver. And yet it built cities, filled treasuries, and fed armies. It was fought over, worshipped, blessed, and cursed. It was smuggled by rebels and sanctified by priests. It was the quiet companion of humanity, from our earliest fires to the technologies of tomorrow. As we close our story, let us reflect gently on the path we have traveled. The dawn. At the dawn of time, salt was survival. Nomads sought it. Farmers preserved food with it. Priests offered it to the gods. In those first small villages, salt was the difference between hunger and plenty, between life and death. It glittered on dry riverbeds and shone in the sunlit pans by the sea. It was ordinary, yet miraculous. The empires. As empires rose, salt became their hidden strength. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, salt filled storehouses and temples. In Rome, it paid soldiers, marched with legions, and gave its name to the word salary. Salt built roads like the Via Salaria. It crossed deserts in caravans of camels. It stacked high in the markets of Timbuktu. It flowed through Venice and Lüneburg, through the halls of kings and the hands of merchants. It was wealth, it was law, it was empire itself. The people but salt was never only in the hands of rulers. It was in the kitchens of families, in the rituals of faith, in the covenants of loyalty. It was shared as a sign of trust, thrown as a shield against evil, offered as a blessing at weddings. In Russia, in Africa, in Japan, in India, everywhere, salt carried meaning. It was the crystal of purity, of endurance, of connection. And when rulers grew greedy, when salt was taxed and controlled too harshly, the people rose. Smugglers carried it in secret, crowds rioted for it, revolutions were sparked by it. Even Gandhi, with his quiet march to the sea, chose salt as his banner of truth. Salt was not only empire, it was also resistance, the modern world. In our own age, salt remains with us. It is in our industries, our medicines, our roads, and our food. It melts ice in winter. It seasons our bread. It powers chemical plants and preserves our traditions. At times it burdens us, in debates over health, in the salting of soil, in the challenges of climate change. At other times it saves us, in desalination plants that give water, in technologies that store solar energy, in rituals that bless and protect. Salt is still here, ordinary yet extraordinary, as it has always been. The future, and it will travel with us into the future. When humanity drinks water from the sea, it will be salt that was removed. When solar power lights our cities at night, it may be molten salt holding the sun's heat. When settlers one day carry the memory of Earth to other worlds, it may be a pinch of salt sprinkled on food that makes them feel at home. Salt will not end, it will endure, just as it has endured through every age. So, as you rest now, think of salt not only as what it is, but as what it means. It is the seasoning on your table, yes, but it is also the seasoning of history itself. It is the bond of trust between friends. It is the preservation of life through hard times. It is the blessing whispered at a wedding, the protection at a doorway, the crystal of eternity in a tomb. Salt is small, but it carries the weight of empires. It is ordinary, but it has always been extraordinary. And now, let the story of salt settle softly in your mind, like crystals sinking gently into clear water. Let the images fade, the caravans in the desert, the Roman legions on the march, the priests sprinkling offerings, the families sharing bread. Let your breath slow, let your body grow heavy. Imagine yourself holding a single grain of salt, pure, white, timeless, a grain that has passed through countless hands before yours, a grain that connects you to all who came before and all who will come after. As you close your eyes, know that you too are part of this great, gentle story. Salt has flavored your food, preserved your life, and now perhaps flavored your dreams. Closing words. So rest now, my friend. You are safe, you are at peace. May your sleep be deep, your dreams gentle, and your heart light. Salt has carried us through the ages. Let it now carry you softly into rest. Good night.